And good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I have a very exciting workshop session coming up for folks. So welcome to the session titled Taking on the Big Conversations on Campus. I will be your host for this session. My name is Dr. Ray Reese, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at Ryerson University. We are joined here today by Dr. Jennifer Wolowick from the Strengthening Canadian Democracy Initiative at the Simon Fraser University Morris J. Wosk Centre for Dialogue. I will let Jennifer introduce herself and get us started. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you and welcome and well done, Ray. I warned you that that was a tongue twister and you rocked it. So very well done. John, you just sent me a note. Change settings so that everyone should now be able to unmute themselves and show video. Yeah, so hopefully the buttons now all work. So I would love to see your faces. It looks like we're a bit of an intimate group, which is fantastic for our workshop. And yeah, so I'm Jennifer. I will be doing a sort of a presentation and then we'll break and have some talks and some things. So let's get started. And then yeah, go ahead as you're sitting down to go ahead and turn your videos on. Love faces. Thank you, Elaine. Good to see you. And others, I'm just getting myself set up on my dual screens here. It's like that, as others want to turn on their camera. All right, you should be able to see a big kind of greenish slide with some photos, correct, Ray? On your
That
side?
Is correct.
John's nodding, great. So taking on big conversations. To get us started, I always like to share my story. So I'm a cultural anthropologist by training. That means I always sort of center other people's cultures and think about ways in which I need to shift my ways of describing or communicating to meet those I'm interacting with. I'm also a democracy enthusiast. So today, what I'll be doing is sharing many of the books that I've been reading and have me excited right about now with all of you to inform some of what we're going to talk about today. I also have a background as a filmmaker. So my first degree was in film production. So I have a lot of experience interviewing people and also storytelling. So a lot of what I'm going to do today and talk about today is going to bring in things that I learned when I was 20 that I now do 18 years later. And think about that. So lots of that pre-thinking, that planning, that's all part of having a fantastic discourse or dialogue. And then finally, my cat's human. His name is Winston. He is Mr. Attitude. And he is actually sleeping us away. So he may pop on the screen, but he's my moral support kitty. And things like that. So yeah, so go ahead and turn on your cameras. I am going to get us kind of warming up here, interacting, because we also want to build our story today. And in a moment. So what to expect today? We're going to set the scene about what dialogue is in a university setting. Some of those challenges. Oh, I see Kitty. Thank you, Elaine. In this setting and sort of build that kind of shared understanding together. We're then going to go into 3 principles for developing dialogue. And again, because I'm a filmmaker, I'm bringing some of that intentionality and using some of that metaphor. So I want to use a metaphor of storyboarding, which is a moment in film production where you plot out everything you're going to do. You know, it's before the actors show up. It's before you're really in the moment and you're super stressed out because you've got to hit all of your marks. But it's that pre-planning thinking. And so what you need to think about there. And then I believe facilitation, which is when you're standing in front of a room and receiving comments and directing a flow, is a very neutral process. However, actually planning dialogue is not neutral. It's very intentional. It's like being a film director. So we're going to talk through kind of 5 tips for creating that space and holding that process. And then we're also going to give you a chance to reflect and see how it applies to your own work for that. So again, in terms of a big conversation, I want to share with you principles and tips really apply across a spectrum and can be adapted to what particular conversation that inspires you and your position in place on that. And so to do that well, it's very important that we get to know each other first and foremost as people. So I love answering this question. The pandemic has given me the greatest kind of opening question to invite people to answer. And since we're a small group, I would love for all of you to go ahead. We're going to talk to each other. And I'm going to ask you a question around what has been your favorite pandemic comfort food? And Ray, I'm going to start with you. Mine has been Oreos. I have eaten more Oreos in the last year than I have in my entire life combined.
So I've got to pick just one. Okay, I will say probably nachos.
Nice.
Yeah.
Good. And how about Clara? Let's go to you. And then Clara, you can nominate someone else. We're going to see who's actually sitting at their computer and listening right now.
Hi, I'm gonna go with soup. Got really into making homemade soup. Can make
What's
a
your
lot of
favorite
it, yeah, and you're set, and it's nice and warm.
Yeah.
I'll
Who would you like to
nominate
nominate?
Elaine.
I taught myself how to make wonton soup, and I eat a lot of it.
Great. And what is your cat's name?
Emma.
Emma. Lovely to meet you, Emma. She can help with us.
She's a sociologist too.
Why don't we pop it over to Peggy? Peggy, what's been your favorite pandemic food? This is the fun of the Zoom world. But anybody else who wants to go? Jump right in.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, Andrea, we can hear you.
Sorry for my video. I don't know what's happening, but my computer doesn't seem to find a video, so I would turn it on if I could. But my favorite comfort food has been, I actually taught myself how to make kind of like a vegan curry with chickpeas. So I literally make that 3 times a week, and I love it.
Fantastic. How about Heidi or Felicia?
My favorite pandemic food right now is probably cheese and crackers.
I've had a lot of dinner of cheese and crackers for sure. Felicia?
At the beginning of quarantine of COVID, I learned how to make bread, which was very fun. I made a different type of bread every week. But lately I've just been eating like brie cheese and crackers.
Welcome, Allie. We're just kind of getting started, getting to know who's here. I'm asking everyone what their favorite pandemic food, comfort food has been. So Lyle, why don't we hear from you? And then we'll go to Derek. All right, Lyle's still warming up his fingers. So Derek, I saw you went on unmute there. So you're awake. Derek, what's your favorite comfort food? Tech glitches. Okay, Allie, it's your turn. So if you want to go unmute and share what has been your favorite pandemic comfort food? All right, we're going to move on. Just because sometimes it goes on mute, sometimes your computer's not cooperating. So nice things. So the other thing we're going to practice today is, the lovely features of Zoom allow us to do what's called a whiteboard. So we all can, you should be able to see a second here. I multitask, whiteboard, share. You see a big white screen?
Yes.
Perfect. So up at the top, you should see, a bunch of drawing, a text, an eraser, that sort of thing. So go ahead and we're going to answer this question of so I described that I'm a filmmaker, I'm an anthropologist, I like democracy, my cat's human. What are 2 words or phrases that kind of describes how you've developed? What defines your thinking as you approach this room? And go ahead and either draw it or put the text box on there. And we'll just kind of see, we're basically creating our own word cloud out of this.
I think, Jennifer, let's just confirm that the technology is working for us.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, Clara and Elaine, do you see the whiteboard functions?
Oh.
No.
I can see the whiteboard, but I don't have any option to write on it.
Okay.
There may be up at the top a more button.
I think we're still viewing your screen, so it's only.
Yeah, maybe if you stop sharing your screen. Yeah.
This is why John's in the room, to save me.
Well, I don't know that I've saved you yet, because we are, now we see each other, but we don't see the whiteboard anymore. So if you want to try that, because I am, and I can try to play with my security features here. Yeah. So
now, do we see a whiteboard?
Yeah, I even see the whiteboard. I'm in the Zoom, but not seeing the functionality of me being able to interact with your whiteboard.
Do you see a mute, stop video, and then a more with a dot, dot, dot on top of it?
Yeah.
Click the more.
Yeah, I'm not seeing that either, unfortunately. I can try to change my view, standard view.
Hi, Lyle, we see you now.
Yeah.
Oh, hallelujah. So I did answer your question. And,
we didn't hear you.
I was in the feed loop or whatever software. It just doesn't work. I cannot. I've tried 2 separate computers, both on Windows 10 using Chrome browsers, and I wasn't able to get the activate my audio or my camera. So I went into the Zoom link, which is an option at the bottom of the screen, and I've reloaded in Zoom and closed the feed loop feed, and that seems to have worked.
Thank you for your problem solving there. Very impressive. Yeah, so I don't think the whiteboard piece is working for us, unfortunately.
That's just fine.
Yeah.
Like I said, we're at the point where I'm really excited for the next generation of virtual convening software.
Yes.
Because it's like, this shows us all the things we could do and we want to do, and the technology just isn't there yet.
We'll all be 3D avatars.
Yeah, exactly. So it looks like everyone's sort of moving. So apparently, Lyle, do you want to walk us through that again so people can find?
Sure. So I was in the feed loop on the main screen for the session, and underneath where it shows the video, there's a little thing that says experiencing issues. Click for additional live stream options. I clicked on that, and then it popped up with a little Zoom window that says, if you're experiencing issues with the live stream, please try the following access options. And I clicked the direct access link, and then it spawned my Zoom software on my computer, which I then loaded. But so that you're not duplicating streams, one on feed loop and one on Zoom, what I did is on the feed loop screen in my browser, I went back to the lobby. And it's just silent then, and then I'm only able to hear audio through the Zoom.
Awesome. Looks like folks are following your instructions and joining us.
It's been a painful journey to get to my level of knowledge with Zoom, which is still not mastery, but yeah, lots of events.
Yeah, so if you can and you can find that, Heidi and I think Peggy's found us, and Andrea and that, I would highly encourage you to join us on Zoom, in part because we get to chat. The chat function will suddenly appear, which is so much great. There we go. Felicia says, thank you, Lyle. So all of us, thank you, Lyle. You are our tech hero for the day.
I don't know about that.
All right. So as you come and join us, we won't necessarily do whiteboard because apparently I'm glitchy on my end with that. We are going to try out the chat function. Hi, Peggy. Yay, you made it. Fantastic. So in the chat, you can, on the bottom, you can open up a chat. I'd love you to type in 2 words or phrases that describe you. So like I'd put cultural anthropologist, I'd put filmmaker, I'd put, white and privileged, whatever lands and like what you'd like the room to know about you and sort of how you're approaching your thinking towards this. So go ahead and pop that into the chat. Right under where Elaine has said, thank you, Lyle, for that. And then we'll kind of keep going. Two words or phrases. I know Ray is a sociologist. He's been teaching for 14 years. Have you found the chat? There we go. Ray? Storyteller, poet, another sociologist. Abolitionist and mother, fantastic. Designer, weirdo, awesome, Derek, nice to meet you. Mental health advocate, woman, retired and interested, fantastic, also great things. So that's all we're, building a community as we talk. Let me do a little admit all here so Andrea can join us and type in as well. And then I'm gonna go back to I'm gonna talk for a little while. And then we'll take a break and have some questions around our first conversations and keep going from there. So I'm gonna get back. I'm aware of the time, so I've got a lot to share with you. So I want to make sure that we have that opportunity. All right. So I am from the Morris J. Wosk Centre for Dialogue. We have been in operation for about 20 years at the Simon Fraser University. Our tagline for our university for the last 10 years has been the engaged university. We think a lot about the place of a university as a public institution, but also as a space of public intellectuals whose responsibility it is to raise up community. And so at the Center for Dialogue, we're most well known for this beautiful room, that makes you feel like you're in the UN in the downtown heart of Vancouver, which is Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam territories. And we host different types of dialogue. And what that means is that we both have, panel conversations, but we get the room engaged. That's why it's a big circle. We also have a consulting realm of the Center for Dialogue that goes into cities and province and federal and hosts meetings with people of different stakeholders. And they go through a process together of a joint deliberation process for different things. So this is an example from the city of Burnaby around the making sure there's affordable housing, because they were experiencing a mass demolition of kind of 3- and 4-story lower income rental properties that would then be turning into 50-story luxury towers. And so they wanted to get a group of community together to work through what should the decision-making process be like and what should they prioritize going forward. And then where I sit is in the strengthening democracy realm. And one of the things that we do is host different types of conversations. And especially in COVID, we sort of shifted into being what's really relevant right now. So we did host a series of online dialogues in Zoom. This is why I'm so good at Zoom, because I've done this a couple times. So we did one, which was advice from secondary students. We led with the question of like, what is one piece of advice you as a student wish you could give your professor for the fall semester? And we actually got students in the room, and we used breakouts so that they could do an idea jam. And then they reported back to about 12 leaders of different universities across BC. And then we kind of compiled that, and we shared those outcomes and that advice to all the different universities. So we do a lot of kind of info gathering and then sharing of those pieces. And then part of me with the democracy is I think about what are the things outside of a dialogue that you need in order for that conversation to go well. So that's part of what we're also going to talk about today. So that's our story. And then, so let's set the scene. Let's think about universities. I'm again going to have you activate the chat in this as soon as I find where my button is for it. There we go. It's the fun of the dual screens here. So universities is a very particular setting to host a dialogue. It's very different than I would say hosting it for a city or doing a public engagement process. And so as I was thinking it through, and this is where I want to ask you as well, what are some of those adjectives you would describe them as? What's kind of the factors that are at play? So they're a very old institution. They're very conservative by nature. I'd also say they can be risk averse in many ways, which is ironic considering they're supposed to be the source of new ideas. So it's very thinking focused. It's also a moment in time where young people are activating their voice. They're learning things, they're transitioning from kind of being under the care of their parents in some ways into what it means to be an adult, what it means to exercise power. While at the same time, their number one kind of action is to learn and pay tuition. So they're also in this very interesting power dynamic. What are some things that I'm forgetting about institutions? Go ahead and fill them in the chat. What are some of those words that you associate with institutions or with a university? Classist, yes. Focus on transition into university for the first while, then focusing on transitioning out. So it can be very structured. Competitive. It can be argumentative, colonial, space to pursue ideas, capitalist, sexist, racist. Elaine, you're honest, not a drag. It's also a space where there's actually lots of recreational activities too. You have sports teams, you have clubs, you have, it's this weird intersection of like work and play and community building, but also like there's lots of like angst with community building as well, because you don't necessarily have a single community, which is also, as an anthropologist, the very definition of community. Communities are messy, exploratory, thinking focused. It's very in your head sometimes. We don't actually think about our bodies, and that's one of the places where we talk about oppression is like, what does it feel like to walk across a campus? We don't have enough conversations about that in our places. So that's sort of setting our scene. It's important as we talk about things like, where are we actually dealing with? And then, where am I going here? And then we're talking about big conversations today. So I want to hear from you. Again, let's do a little chat and then we'll kind of open it up and do a popcorn round of, what are some of those words you use to describe a big conversation? You saw this title, you were attracted to come here. I want to know what you thought that meant. Emotional. Taboo. Interesting. That's a good word. Difficult. Inclusive and diverse. So we can see there's a spectrum. Civic topics. Listen and learn. Excellent. Fear, rage. Elaine is jumping on to my third question. There's lots of feelings that we associate with that. It's excellent. Okay. So a little bit of a pop ground round. Tough. It's work. Difficult conversations are work. They make you feel drained at the end, but you can also feel successful. Those are our first associations. So what kind of topics would you count as a big conversation right now? I'm gonna put someone on the spot. Who's gonna be the first to unmute? Somebody, or I'm just gonna pick someone out. Alicia, I saw you go unmute. What's a topic? What's a big topic that you're thinking about?
Like for me, I've been talking more about OCD and the stereotypes and stigmas around OCD. So that's a big topic in my little bubble, or like in my world. So yeah.
Fantastic. Others?
I'm going to jump in because I'm dealing with this. We're trying to address class discrimination in Canadian universities, and it's not going so well.
Good. Peggy?
Polarized politics. I'm in the US right now, and wow, and what that does to society. It's just, boy, it's big.
It's very big. Lyle, I can tell you have something, tip of your tongue.
Yeah, I typed it in the side note. The sidebar.
There we go. Systemic racism.
Systemic racism would be a big hot one. It's certainly pretty obvious these days.
About Jennifer or Stefan?
Sovereignty, land rights.
Reconciliation?
Yep.
Stefan?
So another conversation that I'm having is the importance of democracy in our society and what we need to do to preserve it.
Yes, indeed. Stefan, great to see your face.
What's top of mind for me is mental health amongst like social impact workers, like people just working towards these types of causes and maintaining our own mental health.
Awesome. So I want you all, if you've got a piece of paper, write down what that big topic is for you right now, because this is about what are you going to take away from this workshop in your own work. So write that down. And then also write, what are some of your emotions that you associated? Where are you starting at with this conversation? You can change your topic as we go and as you're thinking about it, but it's a good place to kind of center yourself and start with yourself. So, Francesca, welcome. See you jumping in. She's having some tech glitches, but that's all good. So when I like to pull together any type of workshop or things, especially because we're so busy, we're so stressed right now, I try to think of simple metaphors or simple things to kind of help them land. And I do a lot of sort of listing of things. It's the way my brain works, the way I like things to work. And so one of the things I started thinking about was storyboarding here. So I mentioned in the beginning that I have a background in film production. And so one of the things you do is you set your scene, you figure out your story. So this is why we've been spending time on what is a university, what are some of these big conversations, because those are our stories, those are our scene setting. And then what you do is for each scene, you sort of try to picture exactly what you want to happen. And everything's very intentional. And you practice it out beforehand. So, as I put this workshop together, I did the exact same thing. I was like, I want to spend 15 minutes doing intros. I want to do 20 minutes here, on here. So I played it in my head as if it was a film. And with that in mind, there's a couple principles that always should, or not always, we're not in a black and white society anymore. Everything has a spectrum or a range, but things I would encourage you to think about are some of these guiding principles for your decisions. So first is know where you're going. Second is prioritize your participants. And third is always to put the dialogue in context. Dialogue is an intentional space, it's an intentional conversation that exists within a much larger life experience and things like that. So I'm going to unpack each one now, but there's your kind of top three. So what do I mean by know where you are going? And the same thing, you would have your script, like you know what your climactic scene is going to be, you know what your resolution is before you actually start your first day of filmmaking. You know where you're going. So in terms of conversations or dialogue or public engagement, it's really important to know exactly what you want your outcome to be. And I'm going to actually share this slide deck in the chat as soon as during our question break, so you can see it and have it for yourselves as well. It's on Google Drive. And so there's a the IAP2 is kind of a public consulting realm. And so they identify 5 different ways in which you're doing public engagement. And it's really important, whether you're in government or you're in power, or if you're a student who's leveraging systems, to really make sure you know what level you are acting upon. So are you informing? Are you trying to consult a decision? Are you trying to involve and really kind of co-generate, which is then like a collaboration? Or are you really like saying, students, here's 20 grand, tell us what we should do with it? Those are all very different levels that would decide your process, and also needs to be communicated upfront with everyone. One of the ways in which things break down very quickly right off the bat is if students or if those who don't have power think they're in a collaborative process because you haven't defined the rules of engagement, and you think that you're actually in a consulting process. So being very clear on where you're at in that spectrum is one of the very first steps, and knowing where you're going. And every decision you make about how you warm up the room, how you engage with each other, will depend on that fact. The other question that's really good for help if you don't know where you're at in that is if you think about a hard conversation, or you think about the space you're creating, is like, what does success look like? This is like a classic project management question, but it's also a classic dialogue question of like, what do you want to get out of this? Do you want a recommendation? Do you want people to just know more? Do you want to have like an action plan out of it? What is your goal? And then also, what does failure look like? Because failure gets at those fears, and failure gets at those emotions that may be causing a bias in your process that you aren't really explicitly talking about. Change the word public to any stakeholder group, and those level engagements still apply. Absolutely, 100%. Students, faculty, and all that. So asking yourself what success looks like helps you define your goal. Asking you what failure looks like helps reveal your own fears, because sometimes you're like, I don't want people to hate me, which means you're probably intentionally gonna like try and not engage in where you really actually need to go. So I always encourage people to name what they think their failures are in that. And then number 2, so I said I love reading, so here's 3 books that I always go back to around this. So as I said, I'm a culture anthropologist. So for me, cultural translation is kind of recognizing that folks always have a value system, belief, knowledge, or actions that make complete sense to them. And I need to understand that. And I can't just tell them that they're wrong. If I want to change their mind, I need to respect where they're coming from and then shift in that way together with them in that way. I had a wonderful methodology in ethnography professor when I was in university, and he told me that the #1 book for any ethnographer, anyone going into community, is the Dale Carnegie book on how to win friends and influence people, which usually makes people laugh because it was one of the very first self-help books. It's one of those that is often focused towards sales, but it's also a very great book at like how important it is to think about the other person genuinely. Because, you know, we all associate sales with like sliminess or charm as like a deceptive practice. That's because it's not genuine sometimes. But one of the lessons I learned is that you can always find one thing, just one thing about someone else that you can genuinely like. And that's a starting point. Doesn't mean that you agree with them completely. Doesn't mean, you know, that you can't push back, that you can't articulate the differences and try to change people's minds, but finding that starting point is important. And that also is that generally making them feel important or feel heard. And then Sally Kohn is a great book, which is a lot about leading with feeling. She goes around and she actually talks to white supremacists. She talks to those folks and is like, how do I reach these folks that I disagree with in those ways? And, you know, and part of those ways is saying where you disagree, saying where you're wrong, and then working it through and doing that work together. So it's important, especially right now, that we keep pushing back against systems, that we keep pushing back about ways in which our natural practices are harmful for other people, but there's also an element where we still need to connect as human beings in those spaces. And then putting the dialogue in context. So someone mentioned they're in the States and the polarization. So my newest sort of academic crush at times has been Robert Talisse. And he doesn't go far enough, I would say, but he introduces this idea of how often all of our everyday interactions are structured by forces that really make our identities part of our political allegiances. I was just in the getting involved in politics panel, and so it was all about, I'm a liberal, I'm an NDP, I'm green, versus I'm someone who supports this issue, or this is where I land on this issue. We now lead with set of political identities. And as we look at the geographical distribution of where we live, you often see the voting patterns align. So, if you're standing in line in a coffee shop, odds are the person ahead of you or behind you, at least one of them probably is pretty closely aligned with your political thinking. And so, or kind of in those ways. And so this is also where universities are interesting, because they tend to be told that they're left-leaning, but even then there's a spectrum, and students will congregate in different spaces and have different conversations and things like that. So how do we create contexts where people can respect each other across those and debate well? And so one of the things he talks about is the need to foster civic friendships. And that is the idea of being able to have enough interactions with people you disagree with to recognize that cultural translation moment. That there are things we need to improve, there are things we have to fight against. There's moments when folks like me of a particular background and a particular position need to absolutely step back and be quiet and let others speak. But to do that, you have to kind of engage with folks on a more depoliticized realm. So he emphasizes you have to have fun together. You have to join a choir. You have to grow a garden. Things that are inherently not political, but allow you to interact with people in a way where you can respect people as human beings. So if you think about your campus culture, how often are students doing that? How often are they doing that with faculty? Is there a faculty-student softball game? Probably not. Where are the spokes where you are inherently kind of practicing those types of things, where you can get to know each other? Administration holds huge amounts of power and in decision-making. Are there ways in which they're engaging with students as human beings? What does that look like? Or not? So you need to develop that context outside of any kind of hard conversation. And so you'll see in this session, I put some of these ideas into practice. So I've identified my goal is to inform. I'm going to talk at you a lot. I want you to have something to take away and go on. I'm not co-developing you, like in making decisions about how we do dialogue. I also, recognize we're all just really stressed out right now. So I intentionally was like, I'm going to go find cartoons, create little moments of delight and things, talk about my cat in order to keep you all awake and do that. So I've thought about your experiences in this space, creating opportunities to engage. And then we spent a lot of time setting the scene. We spent a good 20 minutes just introducing each other. Granted, we did have major tech glitches, but that sense of we shared each other's meals, food. Food is a huge way to bring people together. We also talked about what universities means. We've unpacked some of those icky feelings just a touch and shared those just to create a space in which we here can interact and create moments for you all to connect or learn, or to meet, a cat or not, those things. So I'm going to pause there and just see if there's any quick questions. I'm a bit behind schedule, so I'm only going to probably take one question. So, if anyone's itching, this is your moment. And then we're going to get into a bit of like those kind of actual unpacking. How would you schedule a conversation? Well, giving me a thumbs up. Pretty clear, pretty simple, things like that. Also love to hear feedback from you later on how we could do this better. What am I especially missing? Knowing I don't have everyone's perspective represented in my own background in that space. Okay. So, number one rule in a conversation or a dialogue is it's not a neutral process. It is highly choreographed when it's done well. It is a theater production. It is a film. So whenever you see a scene on a film, every single thing in that scene has been chosen to be there. Whether it's a lamp, whether it's a newspaper, everything there it's an artificial world, like, right? So everything is intentional. It supports the story, it supports what you're doing. So as you unblock, what you're doing in a process of having a difficult conversation, own that. Own that you are designing it, or that you are pushing back against someone else's design around it. If you're being asked to step into a difficult conversation around tuition freezes on campus or not, name, what are we doing? An informed process, a consult process, a collaborative process? Are we empowering? Push back, ask them to define it, because likely they have no idea. And so they're setting you up for failure. And then everything is intentional. It should be intentional, but it doesn't mean that it's dictatorial. So there's an organic process in this. In filmmaking, we call them the film gods. Sometimes the light is just magical and you're like, oh, we need to turn the camera on right now because everything is just landing up. So there's this element of things you cannot predict that happens even when you make a film, even though everything in it is a decision-making factor. There's kind of these elements of surprise. A director may land on a streetscape, a city, and be like, oh, wow, the color of that building is amazing. I want to film there instead of over here. And they'll shift their process. So there's always an element of surprise. So as we talk through sort of how would you schedule something. We begin by connecting as humans. We, again, lead with participants' interests. You're going to start to see some recurring themes between those first three principles and then how you actually schedule it. Game design is also my new favorite love of things that you can incorporate into a process. The center is also know yourself. How are you showing up? What is your goal out of it, depending on whether you're the director or a participant in the process? And then also celebrating that kind of moments of creativity or, these surprises. And also, it's not always going to go well. And so giving yourself permission to fail is incredibly important because you will learn regardless of things. So let's unpack each one of these. So I asked you all to introduce yourself with food. One of the very first things we always do at the Center for Dialogue is we ask people to introduce themselves with a neutral question. We never ask people to introduce themselves as, hi, I'm Ray Reese. I'm a sociology professor at the University of Ryerson. Doing that instantly creates power dynamics in a room. It instantly tells students you have no power. It instantly tells the university professor that, the university president, that they have all the power. So we always pick something neutral and generally something fun. We also will do, if we're in a room together, we'll do what's called a soft shoe shuffle. And we'll ask people, how far did you travel today? And one corner of the room, they'll ask them to physically move and say, I've traveled 5 feet. And then, the other side of the room is I've traveled across the continent. And people will line themselves up on how far they traveled. And they'll giggle. It's really kind of funny because they'll have to talk to each other. You're instantly breaking the idea from being a spectator into being a participant with that. We also, if it's a race-based conversation, we'll kind of unpack. We'll do a fun one like how far did you travel? And then we'll do, okay, reorient. And how comfortable are you in this topic? How knowledgeable are you? Are you someone who, like Ray has shared, has been teaching for 14 years? Or you're someone who is at the beginning of their journey? I'd probably be sort of on the middle spectrum. I've worked with Indigenous, I've worked with inner city African-American communities in San Francisco, but I'm definitely not someone with lived experience. And thus I hold a little bit of that. So identifying where you all sit. And then again, food. If there's any way to incorporate breaking bread together, sharing noodles together that represent where people are coming from halfway through your process, it's a fantastic way to get people to connect and remember those powers. And then again, I'm seriously saying, read How to Win Friends if you haven't. It generally is great. It also is a practice in how someone is actually adapting their style to their audience. He's writing for salespeople, thus he's using sales stories in the advice of that. But it means that you do your research before you show up. You've all identified your topics of what you want to have as a difficult conversation. So what you're doing now is, okay, who's going to come into my room? Who do I want there as a range of spectrums? And then for each one of those stakeholders, What motivates them? What's their motivation to show up today? What's their interest? Don't shy away from that. Humans are incredibly motivated by their own interests. What kind of words do they like? Do they dislike? Where do you fit in that spectrum? Do you use the same language usually? Do you not? Where's going to be your middle ground? What scares them? Again, you'll hear a theme here around like, name your fears. It's okay, we're all human, we have fears. What feelings do you want to bring out? How can you do that? You know, one of the feelings I want all of you have is to feel more energized by this conversation than to be drained. Thus, I am elevating my voice, I am being active, I have introduced you to my cat. All of those things are part of that experience. And then especially what signals help them feel heard? So humans love to feel heard, but we have a different way of receiving that in those ways. This is often why I'm reading aloud what you're writing in the chat to say, yep, I've seen that, I've done that. Other folks, different cultures, it's really like you need to be quiet and you just need to sit there and let them talk for as long as they need to talk. So knowing that and knowing that there are different ways to engage with folks and to be able to adapt accordingly. And also being kind of authentic to how you show up in that space. And then there's this wonderful book, wonderful thing there by Josh Lerner, which is Game Design and Public Engagement. If you haven't heard of the Participatory Budgeting Project, Josh was one of the founders of that. He's now moved on to People Powered, which is about a practitioners of folks who do this really participatory democracy practices. And so one of the things, participatory budgeting is an incredibly empowering practice where those empowered kind of say, we have a budget, $20,000 is often done in schools or in a city. And they hold a game, they hold a competition, kind of like Dragon's Den, to be like, what should we do with this money? What's the best way to spend the money? And so students in Chicago did this, and they had $10,000 from their school district, and they decided to do a rooftop garden as their final project. So it encourages students to do what's called a needs assessment, go do their own research about what's needed, to pitch it to the public, and then the student body all votes on it, and things like that. So you might have a committee at first who sort of gets your short list together, but then the student body is actually the ones who decide on what happens. So you actually get to walk people through a process of ideation, consulting, empowerment, and then actually seeing the outcomes in action. Other realms of this are citizen assemblies, which is where you bring folks together to do a co-learning process. So if you're talking about tuition freezes, you need to learn like how is money spent at universities together first, before you can actually together create a decision around it. And then if there's ways that you can incorporate a game or incorporate, setting up a diagram or something like that that gets people involved is another way to actually activate those pieces of their brain. But in game design, he ends the book with these sort of 4 tips. So conflict and collaboration. Competition actually gets us more invested. This is why our politics is increasingly like a sports arena. It's competition, game. So if you can create a way in which folks can collaborate and then compete with one another, they'll be more interested in different ways. Rules, also very clear, goes back to that sense of where are you going, how are you starting? Everyone needs to know what are the rules of engagement for this space. And if you can communicate that multimodally, which means you're giving them a handout before they even show up, you're expressing it in verbally in the room. You might have a cartoon of what it means to do a, fun engagements and things like that. But something like, we all know you might know how to play checkers. I'm actually not very good at it, but there's something you can go and reference that tells you how to play checkers. You know that you don't pick up the pieces and throw them at your opponent. That's not how you win the game. So having that. Outcomes. So also where dialogue processes tend to fall flat is you've engaged folks, different power dynamics, you've consulted, that's kind of where you want it to be. You've brought these ideas, you then take them behind doors, people talk about them, and then something little happens. There's a change that happens a year later. And they don't ever come back and say, we really liked this part of your idea, so we merged it with this part of your idea. And then they are also really, really bad at then giving credit to the amount of work, amount of advocacy that had to push back. So for example, Simon Fraser University has recently removed its mascot. It had a mascot called the Clan, which is in reference to Scottish, different tribes and clans. But we had African-American students who's were literally representing as their basketball members, the clan. And it was incredibly uncomfortable and incredibly inappropriate for these days. And so students pushed back. They led this process that took many years for a conservative institution to evaluate the pros and cons, do what they do, and they finally removed it. But what they did was then create an announcement where they said, we're removing it because it's inappropriate. And the students said, could you please recognize the amount of work we had to put in to make that happen? Could you give us credit in that? So that's one of those things, like give credit where credit is due. Connect the dots that, hey, students raised the issue, students shared their vulnerability with us, we are responding, and here is how. Connect the dots for anyone who's a participant. One of the things we always do in our dialogues is also do a what we heard report. So we share notes of what we heard, and we always share them back with participants. And then whenever we can, we create, a year later, we go back and do a check-in. It's not always possible. It's not always, advisable from those in power, but it's incredibly important. So just recently, the city of Burnaby, we did a housing dialogue about a year and a half ago. We've now gone back and we've checked in with folks who were integral to that process and said, how did it go? How's it going now? Are you happy with how things are moving? Have you seen the outcomes? And they've said it's done pretty well because we've built in that process. So the process can create engagement, can create empowerment as well as that. And then too often, as I said, like those in power are designing a process for themselves. Often when you do engagement or you have a hard dialogue, you're like, okay, we want to say that we had some consulting to inform our decision-making, but we work in a narrow scope, but we don't actually take the time to share why that's a narrow scope, where we can act, where we can't, with those we're asking to be part of the process. And if you think from a participant perspective, that's incredibly important. That's part of knowing the rules of the game. So again, like always think of, okay, what's the question someone's going to come with? Create a moment to unpack those or reveal those. It's part of why I set the scene so much, to know what topics you guys are thinking of, you folks are thinking of, so that I can lean into some of those throughout the process. So that's your engagement. And then, if there's opportunities to make something fun, it's another great way. So lean into game design. There's a reason why video games are so popular. They tap into human desires, human motivations, and things like that. So you can use that as part of your own motivation. And then, whether you're a participant or you're leading it, it's also really important to have some self-awareness. Know yourself. So I love this graphic. You often, when you think about trauma-informed perspectives, they talk about your 3 brains. So you have your reptilian brain, which is your fight and flight. You have your processing brain, which is your computer. It's like, how do I write something? How does this work? How do I move through my day? How do I schedule? And then you have your neocortex, which is your critical thinking brain. And that's really where university lives. And so, the metaphor I love, which is where this graphic comes from. So instead of reptilian, they call it your monkey brain, because when monkeys get really, really upset, they throw poop and things like that. So it literally has, a little mental breakdown. It's quite dramatic. And then it has your computer brain and it has your professor brain. So knowing what your relationship is with your topic, does it tend to put you towards monkey brain, or is it a computer relationship that you have? What are your feelings? Knowing what your triggers are. Knowing that triggers is also a word. I bump on trigger, the word trigger, which is what sets me off, because I have experience with folks who have PTSD, and I've seen a PTSD trigger. And most of what we use as triggers are really more like activations. They're more like the monkey's showing up, but the monkey isn't throwing poop yet. And so knowing those words that you bump on in those things and what that causes you to do. And then also, like, what are your hacks? So I know when I get bumped on that, I'll unpack it. I'll explain to you why I bump on trigger. Or if someone is really pushing against something that's really important, but it's activating me, I'll write down, like, what is their story? I'll write notes to myself as a facilitator. What are they trying to tell me? What are the feelings in that? I also, as a part of dialogue, which I realize I skipped this slide, so very important to pause here. What is dialogue? And our tech glitch is I slipped this slide. I skipped this slide. So knowing what your process is. Are you naturally a debater, or are you naturally someone who asks questions? So dialogue, as I pause here, is a process of co-learning. So how many folks, raise your hand if you have seen improv, an improv show, comedy improv show? A few folks like that. So this is where comedians get on stage, they're given a skit, and they just go. And the fundamental rule of improv is yes and. So the idea is that someone gives you something, your first response is, okay, I'll do this with it. That is a fundamental core idea of dialogue. I'm getting your story. I think of it as valid, even if I disagree with it, and I'll respond. A dialogue or a debate perspective, which is where most of us and where the university has trained you to be, is more like a no, but scenario. No, you've missed this point. No, you're weak here. So it has a very different connotation as how we build knowledge at times. It's going to be aggressive, but a debate is really like, no, you've missed something here, and let me tell you what you've missed, versus a, oh, there's a strength in your argument about this. Could we build on it together in this way? It's very different. The other rule of dialogue, and how I practice it, would be, is there any way that I can lead with a question? Someone gives me something, what can I ask back? Rather, before I respond, I'll hold my response. And which is also where a debate world, we're like, but this is what I think. We want to jump in and share that versus a, oh, can you tell me more? Oh, what feelings are that bringing up to you? My favorite phrase right now these days, especially as people are using lots of new vocabulary in terms of colonial, in terms of white supremacy, in terms of anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, is I'll say, can you unpack that more for me? I really want to know what they mean when they say colonial, because I want to learn from that. And so that's one of the questions I'm going to when I engage with dialogue is, can you unpack that for me? That's my first and foremost. Oh, you're onto something there. Can you unpack that further? Oh, I can agree with you on here. Oh, this makes me think of this. What do you think? And so it's about drawing someone else's story first and foremost, and then creating a response together. But in that process, I've got to know myself pretty well and know what's going to set me off. And then you want to celebrate those moments. So the best dialogues I've had is you can know it when you're in a really good conversation and you're like, I'm behind schedule. Shoot, should I move on or not? More often than not, you should not move on. You know, if you're in that place and you're unpacking what colonialism is, that's probably the most important part of that shared learning moment. Not, you know, whether or not tuition is going to go up and down, but actually creating a shared understanding of what that means. And so I would throw out my schedule. I'd throw out my, 15 minutes. I'm like, okay, can I shorten our break? Because we need to stay here. So that's what I call those dialogue serendipity moments. Let it go, let it breathe. Throw out your agenda, because your participants in your room are going to tell you what is most important. Same with you're in a student classroom. Like if you've got that really great question and it's really sparking it, as a teacher, okay, I need to stay here a little longer after that. And then humans are super complex and it's not always going to go well, but you're going to learn something no matter what. So I love this drawing. This drawing is out of this book, which is a communications professor's approaches. So it's quite theoretical, but it's about communication and that. And so this is actually a drawing in his book. And so it visualizes that when I say something, all of you on all of your different topics are connecting that to a million different things in your brains. And I have absolutely no way of knowing all of those connections. In communication studies, you'll often call it noise. You're encoding a message and then it goes through all this noise and someone decodes it. So misunderstandings are part of great dialogues. And so thinking about how you repair afterwards is incredibly important. If I were to do this presentation again, I think I'd put repair as like the 6th thing of you're going to misstep, you're going to have a disagreement, someone's going to get activated. They're probably going to say something that they don't want to. If you're having a really good dialogue, it's going to get really uncomfortable. And so then what do you do to repair? Is this when you take a meal break together? Is this when you play some type of, Pictionary game, something that brings back that idea of civic friendships? And then you re-engage with the process. But recognizing that It's not always going to land. Sometimes it's a complete swing and a miss. And then you debrief about why. I've definitely, with my own bosses and things, we've walked out of rooms going, well, that didn't work. All right, what do we do now? So there's a bit of permission to fail because you're going to learn something. And then it's about how do you show up next time and do that in those spaces. So I'm going to pause again. We have about 20 minutes left. We're going to kind of shift this into questions and then a bit of reflection from all of you. So what for you, any questions around these 5 dialogues? Any particular examples you'd like me to unpack for you? What should I unpack more, to use my favorite question? Sorts of things. This is also where we as facilitators recognize the power of silence. You have to like mentally count to 10 and someone will speak because no one likes silence. Lyle, question.
All right, so you create a good framework for having fruitful and inclusive conversations. How important is it to you that everyone participate, everyone vocalize, everyone have something to say? Because I've been in and run many conversations and events and programs and facilitated sessions where I try and create as inclusive a space as possible, a safe space for people, but yet there are still lots of people that don't want to say anything, even though they have something to say. How do you address that?
That's a really great question. I'm gonna do my answer in 2 parts. So one, I've learned personally from a trans facilitator that I love, and they always use the word safer places, because you can never guarantee a place to be completely safe to everybody. I have probably most definitely said something in this session that has activated at least one of you, probably more than once. I have attempted to make it safer by sharing things, by disclosing where I get activated and things like that, but that doesn't mean I'm 100% successful. So when we use the phrase safe space, this is what I was taught, is like it sets you up as a facilitator or as a leader for failure. If you use safer places, it can emphasize that process of repair. So you're always creating a safer place because you have control to make a place as safe as you could possibly make it. But you cannot guarantee, this is where this great graphic comes in around noise. You cannot guarantee what's going on in someone else's head. Secondly, I really lean towards personal agency. And so I give myself permission to say that not everyone has to speak. I think one of the ways in which we do have to reflect on how universities show up, how our the systems of white supremacy show up, is that we really value the ability to verbally articulate ideas and complex ideas. We relish that as a sign of intelligence. Many of us are not linear verbal thinkers. I actually like visuals much better. I have to see something to remember it. But I'm also very skilled because of how I grew up to be able to put sentences together in a way that makes me sound very smart. And so if you're building a process, is there a way in which you encourage people to doodle throughout your session and you'll throw the doodles on the wall? Ways to engage in those multiple learnings. It's one of those, the education pedagogies of like, we're all different thinkers. So are you engaging those different thinkers? It's part of why I also let you all write down separately what your topic is, rather than having us all share it, because that could create some vulnerability there. So you shared some of those big topics, but I didn't ask you to share what is the topic that's most to your own heart of why you're showing it up here. So that different levels of engagement. So it really comes into the different situations. There's no one size fits all. There's no one rule. Part of what you'll find is if you do these sort of setup processes, there's lots and lots of setup, you'll find that the room dynamic is different. And then you can actually have the conversation of being like, I completely respect if you don't want to speak out loud, pass me a note, or, write me a letter afterwards. Because different ways of engaging folks, just help them feel heard. That's a question of what do I need to do to help you feel heard? And one of the things that I'm learning from my own junior staff who are just recent graduates is when they get in a room with a whole bunch of us who've been doing this for a while, they really don't want to talk. They actually want to learn. They want to be mentored. And so we're going, well, it's dialogue. Come on, what is your thought? Generation X, you lead the world. And they're like, we're actually still learning. And you're really making us uncomfortable by asking us to, you know, share my thought as someone who's led one dialogue with our executive director who's led like 1,000. And so creating a dynamic where people can express that, and then you respond instead of saying, oh, I don't really feel like talking. Instead of saying, oh, but you know, you should, I would respond with, well, what do you want to get out of it? Why do you feel uncomfortable? It's that, again, that dialogue of asking a question instead of responding to somebody. If you're seeing someone on the side of a room who's not engaging, sitting with them during a break and just saying, how's it going? What do you wish we did differently? Might be a way that you can learn something new. So yeah, no one size fits all, but that sense of everyone giving yourself permission to recognize everyone's going to engage differently and creating different ways to do that would be how I would try and shape that. We're experimenting more and more with bringing artists or musicians or spoken word into our events, just to activate that and also to give people a way of seeing themselves represented in the process. You know, if you're doing a topic on race, I want to bring in a non-white musician, and I want to bring in non-white food, and show what is most important in that space. Other questions? Elaine, and then Ray.
Try to be brief. So I'm arranging, it'll have to be via Zoom, even if we can be in person, it'll have to be via Zoom, with somebody who holds the ultimate power at a university. And I already know from what they've publicly said what their position on something is and their background. I've done the research, and they've given several talks about their position and what they believe is the solution and how they story the folks that we're talking about. So I'm talking about students from a poverty class heritage trying to, for us to even to get here, and the gender nature is being ignored, and it's all coming from the literature. I don't need to explain to lots of folks who know about this. So I kind of cornered him publicly on Zoom to invite us. I didn't intentionally, but I got the invite, and that was my goal. So at this will be this university president. It will be myself with my research, 7 years of research on this area. As a woman from generational poverty, there will be several students there from generational poverty. We're all women, and I'm hoping a few professors from generational poverty, but it is so stigmatized that people don't want to be public about it. So I am wondering, so there's all these different groups. Of course, profs are looking for something different, students, and the president has stated his position. So I'm wondering how I go about doing this, because he wasn't going to include people with lived experiences of poverty at the table unless you're in leadership positions. So I don't even know where to begin with this, because where I'm at emotionally with this, from talking to people in power, especially at this university for the last 3.5 years, I'm pretty pissed off, and I'm exhausted, and all my research partners are in poverty and suffering, and you can hear my voice, putting myself out there. So how do I ensure that this is going to be, I don't think I need to further my question. And maybe we could follow up after.
Yeah, please shoot me an email afterwards. Yeah, shoot me an email. Let me actually turn this off for a second, and so I can share a link to this as part of it. What I would like, certainly, I like to lead with stories. We're storytellings as human beings, right? And so when people are comfortable, this is what we did with the student input session, was we actually had 4 students tell their stories. We did 20 minutes for that. And then we did ideation. So different ways of how you can engage the storytelling. You've identified that there's already a position. So being very clear on, you know, this is where the rules of the game. What does the game board look like? Is this going to shift? Is this not? What is a realistic goal with you and your team? Like, you've got to name that, and then every decision is meant to bring you towards that. That's the importance of know where you're going. If the odds that the president is going to completely flip their position is pretty small. So what is the winnable goal? And being clear would be with that. And then map it out time by time. to give yourself a map, which will help you feel more in control of the room. And stuff like that as you're doing that. I do want to give us a moment of self-reflection. So Ray, why don't we give you the final question and then we'll jump back into it.
Thank you. It's a bit of a two-parter, and I won't take up too much time because I know that we are, time is of the essence. So I really, really liked how you framed this idea of bump words, which I had never actually thought about. I myself have used the term trigger with my students, like this was a trigger warning, et cetera, et cetera. And it's been met with controversy on both sides, right? Like some students have said, you know, there's no need to give a warning. Students have said, I appreciate the warning, et cetera. So I'm really just interested in how you, just your thoughts more on the positionality of, you know, having these big conversations and big ideas with students in the canon, like in the hierarchy of the university. Like as educators, I believe it's, you know, where it's incumbent upon us to have a pedagogical duty, as you mentioned in the beginning, to, you know, create spaces. I like yourself, I don't use the term safe space. I usually use brave space. I try and create a brave space for my students, but I'm just wondering if you can share your thoughts on that. You know, what does that look like? How do we move towards that direction? How do we foster that within our students?
Yeah, so I was just in a talk, and I would be happy to share the scholar later. Is actually a Stolo scholar in music. And so he created a phrase called hungry listening, which is a Stolo word for white people because they showed up hungry, and then for listening. And I love it because it says, you know, a hungry listener is someone who wants to respond. It's someone who's like, ooh, this fits into my pre-established framework, yay! And is really great. Whereas a non-hungry scholar is like, I'm okay being confused. I'm okay listening for the story to go round and round and round, and I might get the point later. So I like that idea. And so often I'm a hungry listener for sure. And the other part that he really emphasized is when we talk about positionality, the way in which we practice it right now is actually a risk management, I'm using his words, a risk management strategy. So we stand up and we say, I am a settler, I am from here, I'm da-da-da-da-da, I am on these territories, and this is what's going here. And we don't actually then include our ongoing story in the conversation. So I asked you all, I specifically asked, I didn't ask where you are, I didn't ask for, you know, your background. I asked you what forms you're thinking, because it gives me a sense of what is most important to you. And then now, as I answer your question, I want to disclose that because I worked with Indigenous communities, I was diagnosed with complex vicarious trauma. And it took many years for me to heal from that, because these spaces are so toxic and so horrifically damaged from the intentional colonial practices. And so now, as I show up in different places, I emphasize self-management in terms of trauma-informed care. So that's where know yourself and know your own triggers, and also what makes you feel safe. And I try to lead with that practice. So I will share with my own staff. I have, you know, I said recent graduates. So I do a lot of, okay, today I'm going to get up super early. I'm going to do this workshop. It's going to take things out of me. I'm going to go take 2 hours and go for a walk. That's not a sign of weakness. That's a sign of self-care. What do you guys need to do? We are going in and out of really tense conversations. I have one staff member who is of Eritrean descent. She was part of a conversation yesterday on Black urban planning things and anti-racism. And she was activated and she was emotional and she shared it with us. So we ended the meeting 10 minutes early so she could recollect and she could go to her next meeting, and she was great. But we're very open about that, and that it's not so much that we need to share each other's trauma, but we need to recognize, you know what, I need to step away right now. I need to do what I need to do, and I need to come back. And I emphasize those in power to demonstrate that, to name, hey, I'm activated by what you said. It's my own personal story. It's my own personal interactions with what's going on. I need us all to take a collective breath. And this is something I'm learning. I'm not very good at that. When I have been fed questions, especially on Zoom, when you can't see half people's faces, I lean into all the damaging practices of universities. I get debative. I emphasize authority. I emphasize experience. And now I realize, like, I got to get really good at asking the room to take a breath. So in terms of a shared room space, like getting people to do that, getting people to ground is really great. Being open about it. And then, yeah, recognizing it's work. You know, this is a 3-hour class on race. I mean, Ray, you mentioned that was your class this morning, however long it was. That should exhaust you every time. What is the thing that you're going to do right after class? Maybe it's your favorite latte. Maybe it's, you know, you're going to read your favorite book. Maybe you're going to go and pet your cat. But what makes you feel safe again? It's part of that space of doing that. And then it's a work in progress. It's not going to be great all the time. But recognizing it's labor and you go in and you go out, I think is one of those ways in which for students to learn, it's definition of learning self-management. As part of the pedagogies we don't necessarily practice enough in universities.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you all, so I'm going to leave you with this homework assignment because we don't have time. Can you still see my screen? Yeah, okay. Is write down these questions. So for your particular thing, so Elaine, you brought up a very specific example. Many of you have other sort of things that you're working on. So with these 5 principles in mind, write down what is your goal? Which of the tips we talked about today is most important to your efforts? What's one thing you're going to start or stop doing? I also love this question. Part of my brain as an interviewer, I like to give people a really simple starting question and then expand. You can't be like, what is the transformational practice that you are going to engage in a collaborative experience with your students? Like, it was like, I don't know how to answer that. So I always give a really simple question of like, what are you going to start? What are you going to stop doing based on what you learned today? Who can you enlist for support? You don't have to take all this on yourself. It's not a good idea to take it all on yourself. And then the number one thing I've learned about making your dreams happen is you have to identify what is your very next step. Maybe it's downloading the slide deck. Maybe it's picking up this book. Maybe it's having a conversation with your research assistant about what you learned today and doing that. I'm going to share the slide deck into the chat so you all have it. It's not going anywhere. So you can reference later. So go ahead and use that and download it as you want. Go ahead and look up, you can find our semester or our Center for Dialogue. There are resources there on, different types of what dialogue is, practices, engagement things. There's a Beyond Inclusion guide, which is how do you now go beyond diversity and inclusion into an actual valid process. And we'll do that. And then just to wrap up today, I would love to do a pop ground round around what? Oops. What is one thing that you're going to take away today? One thing, maybe it's one tip, maybe it's one answer to my question, one thing. And then who would you like to share that with? Friend, colleague, boss, things like that. So go ahead, we're at 2 minutes left. So if I had 5 minutes, we would unmute and go around, but we don't. So maybe we'll throw that in the chat. One thing you're taking away, one tip that felt most important, one principle, and then who are you going to share it with? This is one of the practices I've learned from working with Indigenous folks on the Northwest Coast, which is particular practices around witnessing. And you come together, and when you show up to a feast, you have a responsibility to take what you have heard and share it with someone else. That's how the legal system in these territories has worked for tens of thousands of years, because it's about creating that shared oral history. So I ask folks whenever I do these things is, what are you taking away? And then who are you going to be responsible to share it with? Things like that. So go ahead and write that in the chat. Bump words, gamification concepts, partner social workers, students and colleagues. Great. Self-management. Knowing our own boundaries is incredibly important. I like to also use the phrase lead with vulnerability. Safer places or trigger or not. Or even, you know, for Peggy, one thing is like, why do we use the word trigger in particular? Are we actually having a thoughtful process around it? Or we heard it and now we use it? Planning, yes. Your homework, so important. Dialogues or difficult conversations are won or lost before you show up. I just shared with one of my employees last week, you know, the management pattern of how to have a difficult conversation, you know, what that formula is. And she was able to go and practice it. She's like, what do I want out of it? Okay, what's our shared values? Okay, what do I want them to know? Okay, what do I want them to hear? And she planned it out, and she went and she took our executive director behind doors and she rocked it. And she came out being like, I had a fantastic conversation. And I was like, you realize you had such a fantastic conversation because you planned, because you put the work in. And she's like, yeah, I learned so much from that. So dialogue is improv in a movie. Yes. Multiple methods for engaging, for sure. Structures for conversations. Yes, so as a final word of takeaway, I've learned this the hard way. I avoid town hall settings as much as possible. Town halls are where you're like, here's the open question, anyone can jump in. If they're not done well, they create a space where each speaker feels like they have to emotionally outdo the person that came before. So I try to give very structured questions. Okay, we're talking about this, and we're talking about this. But to do that well, everyone has to come into the room knowing what the rules are, knowing what is in our game board and what is outside of it. So creating that process. And then we also do sort of things around like a positive, a negative, and then back to a positive. You know, what are the strengths? It's the reason why when we asked students around COVID, we didn't say what's going wrong. We gave them a very specific question of what is one piece of advice you want to share? It was solutions oriented, solutions generated. It's always easy in academia. We tend to do this. It's where we land. It's like, let's unpack all the problems and say why it's a problem. And then we have no emotional energy for solutions. So those sorts of things. Still
Hey,
not.
Jennifer, I see a note in the, that people aren't seeing the link to the slides.
All right, let's try it again. Peggy, it should be in the chat right below yours. Work?
No.
No. All right, well, I'll put my email on a blank slide, and if you email me, I will email it to you. Why can't I edit? So Jay Wolowic, JWOLOWIC at sfu.ca. Okay. Anyone need me to read that aloud one more time? JWOLOWIC.
I think what happened, Jennifer, is I just changed the setting in the chat. It said to everyone in the waiting room, and I just changed it to everyone publicly. So I think if you do repost the link again,
I see.
Yeah, it will go to everyone.
That is totally my fault.
That's okay. Yeah.
Thank you for catching it. See, you did have a very important job today.
My pleasure. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, perfect.
Yay, we figured it out.
Yay.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining, for being such active listeners, for, you know, responding when I asked and those things. It was great to see the faces of those I can see, the names of those that I can't. And I do hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful day. And then practice your own self-care later today, because you've all been doing work for 3 hours.
Thank you, Dr. Wolowic. I just want to give a very formal thank you to you for such a very engaging. I learned so much in this session, and wish you could have gone on more. And there's a lot of takeaways and a lot to reflect on. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us and share your knowledge with us, so that we can all move towards transformative, democratic social change. So wishing you all well and have a wonderful rest of the week. Thank you, Dr. Wolowic.
Thank you.